This video is going to cover two structures that can be used when writing a memoir. The first structure is a narrative structure. This structure is broken down into three parts, part 1, 2, and 3. Part 1 is the beginning, part 2 is the middle, and part 3 is the end. Part 1 is normally about 25% of your story. This is where you set the stage for your story and hook the reader. You introduce the main person, the protagonist, which is usually you, anybody else that's involved in the story, and make sure you let your reader know who they are, what their personalities are, and your relationship with them briefly, as well as set the scene and let the reader know where the story takes place. Part 2 is the middle. In this section, this is where you introduce kind of what the problem in your memoir or your story is from that small moment that you chose. This is where you describe your actions and reactions, your emotions and feelings in depth. This is the largest part of your narrative memoir if you choose this structure. This is about 50% of your memoir. And this is where you really get to the heart of your story. Part 3 is the ending. This is about 25% of your story, and this is where you let your reader know what the solution to your problem or conflict was. You should describe the lesson that you learned from the small moment or experience that you had, and you want to make sure that you leave your reader satisfied, knowing that it's the end of your story and what you learned. You may even want to connect with the reader so that they too can learn right along with you. The other structure that you can choose from is the reflective structure. This is 3 parts, just like narrative. However, instead of the 3 parts being the beginning, middle, and end, this is more formal in nature. This focuses more on the lesson that you learned. So the introduction here, you really want to hook your reader with some kind of a statement that draws your reader in. Maybe a piece of dialogue from the story, the highest, most kind of dramatic part of your story. And then you provide necessary background information to your reader so they kind of understand what your story centers around. And you end your part 1 with a thesis statement where you let the reader know right away what the lesson you learned from this moment in your life is. Then part 2 for the reflective structure is your entire story. It is the beginning, middle, and end of your story. You describe the small moment with lots of details, giving the feelings, emotions, actions, reactions, the setting, all of that information in lots of detail for your reader here. You should use a lot of sensory details and strong verbs. Make sure you use transitions so that your reader can follow the flow of the story and what happened when. And that's what goes in part 2. In part 3, you go back to that thesis statement and the lesson that you learned, and you let your reader know how that lesson has truly impacted your life. So those are the 2 structures. Narrative is written more in kind of real time, with the beginning, middle, and end being part 1, 2, and 3. And reflective is written more as kind of what it sounds like, a reflection where you're looking back and focusing more on the lesson that you learned from that moment and how that lesson has impacted your life. So if we were to take a look at some examples of how we would reorganize a story if we were to focus on those 2 structures. If we were to do a narrative structure about, let's say, a high school prom story, this is what one might look like. Part 1 would start with the beginning of the story. You introduce the characters, the setting, and the conflict. So, character is me. I'm not popular. I'm shy. Another character is the date for the prom, who's the most popular guy in school, and he's best looking. And the conflict is that the great-looking guy asked me to the prom in front of almost the entire school. I'm super excited about it, looking forward to it. I talked to my best friend about it from next door, and he tells me that it's a setup to embarrass me. Okay, and that is part 1. That's the beginning of my story. Part 2 is the middle. I have my reactions to the fact that it's a setup. I share my emotions about whether I trust my friend or the date. I start to become paranoid about people talking about me, laughing about me behind my back. And I keep going back and forth between, is it really a setup or am I just imagining things, to realizing I have to make a decision. Am I going to talk with my date about whether it's a setup or not? Or am I just going to go ahead and go and pretend like I didn't know about this? So then I get to part 3, and this is the end of my story. This is where my problem or my conflict is solved. I make my decision that I'm going to talk to my date. He admits that it was a setup and he apologizes, and I no longer have a date to the prom. I share this with my friend next door, and he says that he'll take me to the prom. And we become even better friends, and after years of being together, we fall in love and we get married. And that is my narrative memoir example. So if I were to switch that and move to the reflective memoir structure, you can see how that would look a little different. I would probably start my part 1 with a quote of the next door neighbor telling me it's a setup to draw the reader in right away. Then I would explain what the setup was, that the most popular good-looking guy in school asked me to the prom in front of everybody. And then I would state that based on this experience, I learned the lesson, here's my thesis, good can come from the bad. Then in part 2, I tell the whole story from start to finish. I include beginning, middle, and end. So I go through being asked, kind of being paranoid, going back and forth, thinking I need to talk to him, deciding to talk to him admitting it, the date being canceled, and my best friend taking me, us falling in love and getting married. Then I get to part 3. And this is where I go back to that thesis statement. And I explain how the good, being able to marry my best friend, came from the bad, being set up for embarrassment at prom. And how, had that not happened, I wouldn't have gone to prom with my best friend, and we would not have started that type of relationship. So the focus here with reflective is more on the lesson I learned and how it impacted my life, whereas narrative, the focus is the story itself. So you need to choose the structure that best fits your small moment. Does it make more sense to write it in real time as a narrative, or does it make more sense to write it as a reflection and follow that reflective structure? That's your choice. Make the one that best fits your small moment. Those are your memoir narrative structures to choose from.